The candlelight flickers, casting long shadows against a throne draped in crimson velvet. The air smells of wax and damp stone, heavy with the weight of secrets never spoken aloud. You hear the shuffle of silk slippers retreating down a corridor, a door slamming shut. And then silence, as if the palace itself is holding its breath. Behind those gilded walls sat a man who called himself king, yet he ruled more like a phantom of excess and cruelty. Whispers clung to him like perfume, whispers of scandal, betrayal, and desires too twisted to name. Was he a victim of history's venom, or truly one of the darkest monarchs to wear the crown? The truth is hidden in the smoke, and tonight you will step inside his shadowed court. The nursery of a royal palace should be filled with warmth, the soft lullabies of nurses, the clinking of toys, the laughter of children echoing through long marble halls. But in the late 18th century, the young Ferdinand was cradled not in joy, but in tension. Spain was a kingdom crumbling under the weight of its own grandeur. And even as a boy, Ferdinand was expected to carry that heavy crown, before he ever understood what it meant. The walls around him smelled of incense and damp velvet, reminders of rituals and prayers offered for a dynasty desperate to maintain control, courtiers whispered behind painted fans, speculating whether this awkward child could one day stand against the tide of decline. His tutors spoke of duty, honor, and divine right. But their words slipped into the silence of a boy whose eyes often darted downward, as though avoiding the gaze of history itself. Ferdinand's childhood was not marked by the freedom of innocence. Instead, it was a theatre, stage where every gesture, every silence was observed and measured. His father, Charles IV, was seen as weak. His mother, Queen Maria Louisa, was feared and despised. In the echo of their reputations, Ferdinand learned quickly that power was less about virtue and more about survival. Imagine being that boy, standing in the shadow of towering columns, hearing the distant toll of church bells while courtiers maneuvered in hushed tones around your very existence. The scent of candle wax mixed with cold drafts from open windows, and every day felt like a rehearsal for a role he wasn't sure he wanted to play. From the beginning, Ferdinand's life was stitched with contradictions, honor and humiliation, expectation and fear. The boy who would become king was already learning that the throne was not a promise of glory, but a cage, lined with gold. As Ferdinand grew older, the palace corridors became both his classroom and his prison. The tapestries on the walls depicted heroes of Spain's golden past, warriors, saints, and kings who had once commanded empires across oceans. Yet for Ferdinand, these faces were not sources of pride, but reminders of a legacy he could never hope to equal. Each step he took down those halls seemed to echo a question. Would he restore Spain, or finally preside over its collapse? His father, King Charles IV, tried to shape him with lessons of piety and obedience, but Charles himself was seen by many as a monarch without spine. The boy noticed how ministers and nobles bypassed his father's authority, whispering instead. In the ears of his mother, Queen Maria Louisa, rumors swirled like smoke that she wielded the true power, and worse, that her affections for her favorite courtier, Manuel Godoy, blurred the line between politics and intimacy. For young Ferdinand, these whispers were daggers. Each tale of Godoy's growing influence festered into resentment. He learned early that betrayal did not always come from foreign enemies. Sometimes it came from within one's own family. The image of monarchy as a divine, unshakable order shattered before his eyes, replaced with a vision of intrigue, humiliation, and the endless struggle for dominance. In private moments, Ferdinand's personality hardened. He became cautious, withdrawn, and suspicious of those around him. His tutors noted his reluctance to trust, his tendency to linger on perceived slights, and his silence in conversations where other princes might have displayed charm. Beneath the gilded ceilings of Madrid's palaces, a boy was slowly becoming, a man shaped not by virtue, but by fear and envy. The sweet smell of orange blossoms from the palace gardens often drifted through open windows, but to Ferdinand, even the air felt heavy with secrets. He was a prince born into splendor, yet raised in shadows, and the contradictions of his childhood would one day spill into his reign, staining Spain itself. By the time Ferdinand reached his late teens, Spain itself was trembling. The French Revolution had shaken Europe to its core. Monarchs across the continent feared the guillotine's shadow, and whispers of reform and rebellion drifted into Iberia. Like an uninvited storm in this fragile atmosphere, Ferdinand's role as heir took on an urgency that weighed heavily on every breath he drew. At court, factions formed around him. Nobles who despised Queen Maria Luisa and Godoy began to see Ferdinand as their symbol of resistance. They painted him as the alternative, the hope of Spain, the prince who might restore dignity to the crown. Yet, Ferdinand himself remained a paradox. Outwardly dutiful, inwardly brooding, he was learning to play the game of appearances, wearing masks of obedience, while nurturing resentment in silence. Behind closed doors, he scribbled letters filled with suspicions and accusations. He plotted in secret with courtiers who urged him to challenge his parents' authority. Each alliance brought him closer to the throne, but also further into the shadows of deceit. Instead of noble vision, Ferdinand's politics grew out of personal grudges and a desire to escape humiliation. The palace itself reflected this turmoil. Once resplendent, with music and ceremony, its halls now carried an atmosphere of paranoia. The scent of incense from daily masses could not mask the staleness of fear that clung to the air. Every knock at the door, every rustle of silk in the corridors, carried with it the possibility of betrayal, and so the boy who once avoided the gaze of history now found himself at its center. Yet he was not stepping onto the stage as a confident heir, but as a hesitant, distrustful young man, haunted by secrets he could never untangle. The crown of Spain was drawing closer, and with it, the test of whether Ferdinand would rise as savior, or falter as prisoner of his own bitterness. The year was 1808, and Spain was a nation on the edge of collapse. Streets echoed with the cries of hunger, the distant thunder of armies, and the whispers of conspiracy. Into this storm stepped Ferdinand VII, newly crowned king. But his throne was not a seat of power, it was a chair bound in chains. When Ferdinand seized the crown from his father, many hailed him as a savior. Crowds filled Madrid, their cheers ringing through narrow cobblestone streets as bells tolled in celebration. For a fleeting moment, the young king was the embodiment of hope, a symbol of resistance against the hated Godoy, against corruption, against weakness. But beneath the fanfare, reality was tightening its grip. Spain was no longer free to decide its fate. Napoleon's shadow loomed large across Europe. Ferdinand's reign began with a cruel paradox. Though adored by his people, he was distrusted by France, manipulated by his own advisors, and incapable of asserting true control. His court was a nest of serpents, each minister whispering conflicting strategies, while foreign powers schemed beyond Spain's borders. In candlelit chambers, maps of Europe lay scattered, ink-stained with frantic calculations. Yet Ferdinand himself hesitated, unsure of where to place his trust. The king's personal insecurities magnified the crisis. His suspicion of allies, his silence in councils, his inability to make bold decisions, all left him vulnerable to manipulation. The cheers of his people soon gave way to murmurs of doubt. Was this the leader who could save Spain, or merely a puppet awaiting his strings to be pulled? The smell of smoke lingered in the streets as French troops advanced closer, their boots pounding foreign soil into Spanish earth. And within the palace, Ferdinand's throne no longer gleamed with promise. It trembled under the weight of betrayal, as Spain's young monarch realized that the crown he fought so hard to claim was not freedom, but a prison of shifting loyalties and foreign domination. The trap was laid with elegance. Napoleon, the master strategist of Europe, invited Ferdinand to meet under the promise of alliance. To the inexperienced Spanish king, weary of conspiracies at home and desperate for recognition abroad, the invitation felt like a path to legitimacy. He did not see the jaws of the snare closing until it was far too late. In 1808, Ferdinand travelled north, greeted not with honour, but with subtle restraint. The French palaces he entered dazzled with chandeliers, perfumed halls and gilded ceilings. Yet their beauty masked a cage. Guards followed his every step. Letters he wrote were intercepted. Decisions he believed he made were quietly overridden. He had exchanged one prison in Madrid for another in France. Napoleon played his hand mercilessly. In private chambers, heavy, with the smell of tobacco and wine, he pressured Ferdinand into renouncing his throne. With pen and ink, surrounded by men who smiled with cold calculation, the Spanish king surrendered his crown to a foreign emperor. The cheers of Madrid that once thundered in his ears now seemed like echoes from another life. Back in Spain, chaos exploded. Uprisings tore through the streets. The people who once worshipped Ferdinand now cried for vengeance against the betrayal. In their eyes, their king had abandoned them, selling Spain's honor to the very tyrant they despised. Ferdinand, meanwhile, languished in French captivity. The gardens around his residence were lush with roses and fountains, but to him, they reeked of humiliation. He paced marble floors like a restless ghost, imagining himself still seated on a throne, while in reality, his crown lay in Napoleon's pocket. It was here, in gilded captivity, that Ferdinand's bitterness deepened into something darker. Stripped of power, he brooded not on how to save his country, but on how to reclaim the throne, at any cost, and when fortune eventually returned him to Spain, he carried with him not wisdom from suffering, but vengeance sharpened by humiliation. When Napoleon's empire began to crumble, the wheel of fortune turned once more for Ferdinand. In 1814, after years of gilded captivity, he returned to Spain. Crowds flooded the streets in wild celebration, throwing flowers, shouting his name, and hailing him as El Deseado, the desired one. For a moment, it seemed the nightmare had ended. Spain had its king back, but Ferdinand had changed. Humiliation had twisted into bitterness, and fear into cruelty. The man who stepped off the carriage was not the boy prince of promise, but a hardened monarch, determined to silence any force that might threaten him again. The cheers of his people were not received with gratitude, but with suspicion. He no longer trusted the very voices that once lifted him. Spain itself was scarred. The Peninsular War had left cities in ruins, fields barren, and families broken. Liberal reformers sought to rebuild the nation with a new constitution, promising rights, limits on royal power, and a vision of progress. For a brief moment, Spain seemed ready to rise from its ashes, but Ferdinand crushed that hope with an iron fist. In a chilling act of betrayal, he annulled the liberal constitution and declared absolute monarchy restored. The ink on reformist dreams had barely dried before it was torn apart, burned, and cast into the wind. Those who had fought for liberty found themselves imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The air in Madrid, once alive with chants of freedom, now carried the smell of fear. Inside the palace, Ferdinand surrounded himself with loyalists, priests, and spies. Chains replaced dialogue, and shadows replaced light. Every whispered dissent could mean death. The king, who had once been a symbol of national salvation, now shackled Spain tighter than Napoleon ever had. And so, while Ferdinand sat on his throne, it was not Spain that was free. It was Spain that was bound, kneeling beneath the weight of a monarch who feared the world more than he sought to lead it. Beyond the throne room, where decrees were signed and politics debated, another story unfolded, one whispered through palace corridors, embroidered into gossip and recorded in scandal. Ferdinand VII's private life was as turbulent as his reign, and it would become a theatre of desire, obsession, and humiliation that forever marked his legacy. The king married 4 times, each union cloaked in ritual pomp but followed by disappointment and rumour. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, entered Spain as a young and hopeful queen. But behind the heavy curtains of their chambers, the marriage soured. Ferdinand was whispered to be jealous, suspicious, and consumed by insecurities. Court gossips whispered that he struggled with intimacy, that his desires were tinged with cruelty, that his obsession with heirs was not matched with tenderness. Maria Antonia died young, and whispers blamed Ferdinand. Some claim neglect, others even poison. Though historians debate the truth, the shadow of scandal clung to him like a perfume that could not be washed away. The palace itself magnified these rumours. Imagine candle-lit chambers thick with incense, velvet drapes muffling the outside world, and courtiers tiptoeing through darkened halls, careful not to disturb their king's moods. Servants carried trays of wine and fruit past doors they dared not linger by, aware that the royal bedchamber was a place of both ritual and torment. As the years passed, Ferdinand remarried again and again, each time with the same desperate hope, an heir to secure the Bourbon dynasty. Yet his personal flaws turned each marriage into a battleground. Whispers of impotence, perverse demands, and cruel temper echoed through salons and embassies alike, staining Spain's royal image before the eyes of Europe. In the public eye, Ferdinand was a monarch draped in gold, but in the private realm of silk sheets and candlelight, he was a man at war with his own body, his wives, and the very idea of love. Ferdinand's later marriages revealed even more of the torment that consumed his private life. After Maria Antonia's death, he married Maria Isabel of Portugal, a gentle and dutiful princess. At first, there was hope that this union might heal the scars of scandal. But palace walls soon whispered familiar refrains. Ferdinand's cruelty, his paranoia, and his desperate obsession with producing an heir. The pressure was relentless. Night after night, attendants prepared the royal bedchamber with ritual precision, silk sheets smoothed, perfumes scattered, prayers whispered under breath. Yet within those chambers, tenderness withered. Maria Isabel, though loyal, became a vessel for dynastic duty rather than a partner in love. She bore him a daughter, but the absence of a male heir gnawed at Ferdinand like a curse. Her sudden death in childbirth left the king grief-stricken, but even grief seemed to harden into bitterness. He married again, this time Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a girl so young and inexperienced that their union became a cruel spectacle. She was terrified of the duties expected of her, her innocence clashing with Ferdinand's demands. Servants whispered of her tears, of nights filled with silence rather than consummation, of a queen more child than woman. In the salons of Europe, Ferdinand's reputation darkened further, his marriage mocked as a grotesque parody of royal duty. Yet Ferdinand would not relent. A fourth marriage followed, to Maria Cristina of Naples, who at last provided him with daughters. Among them, Isabella, the future Queen of Spain. But even this success was not free from scandal. Court gossips claimed Maria Cristina maneuvered behind the scenes, shaping policy while Ferdinand grew weaker, his body failing even as his grip on power remained iron. The royal household became less a home than a stage. Queens paraded as pawns, heirs demanded like tributes, and whispers of humiliation drifting from chamber to chamber. Ferdinand's throne was gilded, but his bed was a battlefield, and every union only deepened the shadows of scandal that clung to his reign. By the final years of Ferdinand's life, the whispers that had long haunted his private chambers grew louder, merging with the political storm outside. His body, once propped up by ritual and ceremony, was failing. Gout gnawed at his joints, leaving him swollen and bedridden. His face, once pale and watchful, sagged under the weight of illness and indulgence. Yet even in decline, his obsession with heirs and control consumed him. The court lived in a constant state of tension. Physicians came and went, their hands reeking of herbs and oils, their remedies little more than bandages on a decaying monarch. Courtiers lingered in candlelit antechambers, waiting for news, trading rumors in hushed voices. Was the king dying? Would Spain be thrown into chaos again? It was during these years that Maria Cristina, his fourth queen, seized quiet influence. While Ferdinand struggled to walk across marble floors, she maneuvered among ministers, securing her daughter Isabella's future claim to the throne. Yet this maneuvering came at a cost, sparking fury among factions who believed the throne should pass to Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos. The king's personal failures had become a national crisis. His inability to secure a stable line of succession fractured Spain, setting the stage for the bloody Carlist Wars that would erupt after his death. What began in the secrecy of his bedchamber now spilled into the streets, where muskets would roar and families would be torn apart. Even in his final days, Ferdinand remained suspicious, bitter, and fearful. He clutched at power with trembling hands, signing decrees from his sickbed, his chambers thick with the smell of sweat, candle wax, and decay. The man who had once been El Deseado, the desired one, now inspired dread rather than devotion. And so, Ferdinand's scandals were not confined to whispers of lust or cruelty. They had become Spain's inheritance, a legacy of fractured loyalties and unhealed wounds. The private rot of the king's chambers had spread across an entire nation. The autumn of 1833 carried with it the heavy toll of bells across Madrid. Inside the royal palace, Ferdinand VII lay in his bed, a figure more ghost than king. His body was swollen, ravaged by gout and illness, his breath shallow, his skin pale. As candle wax, the air of his chambers reeked of sickness, damp linens, bitter medicines, and the faint sweetness of incense burning endlessly at his bedside. This was not the glorious end of a monarch who had saved his kingdom. Instead, it was the quiet unraveling of a man who had once been adored as El Deseado, but who now lay dying, surrounded by courtiers who whispered not prayers, but calculations. For them, the king's body was less a man than a key to power, to succession, To the fate of Spain itself, Maria Cristina, his fourth queen, hovered near, her hands trembling as she clutched the future of her daughter Isabella. Outside, loyalists to Don Carlos sharpened their rhetoric, vowing that the throne should pass not to a child, but to Ferdinand's brother. The palace walls, heavy with tapestries and gilt, seemed to lean inward with the weight of looming civil war for Ferdinand. These final days were filled not with reflection, but with bitterness. He had ruled with an iron hand, crushed liberal hopes, and clung to power as if it were life itself. Yet as he stared at the flicker of candles in his room, he could not silence the question that lingered. Had he preserved Spain or broken it further? Outside the palace, the people felt no unity in their grief. For some, his death was an ending to tyranny. For others, the loss of a monarch chosen by destiny. Spain itself trembled, perched between two futures, each soaked in the blood of what was to come. The king who had once been desired by all now departed as a man despised by many. His legacy already fractured before his final breath was drawn. The moment Ferdinand's final breath left his body in September 1833, Spain did not find peace. It ignited. His death tore open the very wound his reign had refused to heal. The question of succession, Maria Cristina declared their daughter, Isabella, only 3 years old, the rightful queen, but the air in Madrid was thick with doubt. Could a child, barely able to walk, carry the weight of a fractured kingdom? Supporters of Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, thundered that the throne belonged to him. Within weeks, Spain was plunged into open rebellion, the streets echoing with musket fire and cries of loyalty divided. Thus began the Carlist Wars, a conflict that drenched Spain in blood for decades. Families were split, villages burned, and entire provinces shattered by a struggle born not simply from politics, but from Ferdinand's personal failures. His inability to secure a stable line of succession had planted the seed, and now the nation reaped its poisoned fruit. The countryside reeked of smoke and gunpowder. Soldiers marched through mud-soaked fields, banners of Isabella and Don Carlos flapping like torn wings against grey skies. Priests declared divine favour for one side or the other, while mothers wept over sons conscripted into a war that seemed to have no end. Meanwhile, Maria Cristina ruled as regent, her power contested at every turn. Whispers of her alliances and scandals swirled, but she clung fiercely to her daughter's claim. Yet every decree she signed bore the invisible shadow of Ferdinand's legacy. The distrust, the authoritarian grip, the fractured faith of a people who had been betrayed too often by their crown. In this way, Ferdinand's ghost lingered, not in statues or songs of praise, but in the civil war he left behind, in the families divided by allegiance, and in the endless question that haunted Spain. Had their king been a saviour trapped by circumstance, or a tyrant who carved wounds that would bleed for generations? Decades after Ferdinand VII was lowered into his marble tomb at El Escorial, his name still carried a bitterness that time could not wash away. For many Spaniards, he was remembered less as a king and more as a cautionary tale, a man whose reign smothered progress and whose death fractured the kingdom. Historians would argue endlessly about him. Some painted him as a victim of circumstance, born into an age of revolution and war, trying desperately to cling to a throne surrounded by conspiracies and foreign powers. Others, more harsh, branded him the worst monarch Spain had ever endured, a ruler who betrayed allies, crushed freedoms, and left behind a civil war as his final gift to his people. But for the common folk, the memory was simpler. They remembered hunger in the villages while the palace feasted. They remembered soldiers dragging sons to fight in wars that seemed endless. They remembered fear, the silence in the streets, when dissent could mean chains, exile, or worse. The most desired king had become, by the end, the most reviled. And yet, the irony of his legacy lay in his bloodline. The child he left behind, Isabella II, would ascend the throne and struggle under the same storms her father had unleashed. Her reign, too, would be marked by instability, scandal, and exile. Proof that the broken crown Ferdinand left behind could not easily be mended. In the end, Ferdinand VII's story was not one of glory, but of fracture. His reign became a mirror of Spain itself, torn between past and future, clinging to tradition while yearning for change, and forever haunted by the cost of one man's desire for control. As the centuries turned, his figure faded into the long gallery of history's flawed monarchs. Yet the echoes of his rule still linger in Spain's memory, a reminder that a crown may rest on a man's head, but the weight of it always falls on a nation's shoulders. The story of Ferdinand VII is not merely about a single man's cruelty, paranoia, or excess. It is the story of a crown that strangled itself, of a throne weighed down by fear of change, and of a nation caught in the suffocating grip of one king's desire to control every breath of his people. He began as El Deseado, the desired one, the symbol of hope after foreign occupation, but hope quickly curdled into despair. By the time of his death, Spain was no closer to stability than when he first ascended the throne. If anything, it was weaker, divided, and standing on the edge of civil war. And perhaps this is the most chilling legacy of Ferdinand VII, that a king who sought to preserve tradition, to crush liberalism and silence dissent, only ensured that chaos would bloom in the shadow of his reign. His life reminds us that power, when clutched too tightly, shatters in the hand that holds it. The marble tomb of El Escorial still holds his bones, but in the memory of Spain, Ferdinand VII lives on as both a warning and a wound, a reminder of how one man's crown can break an entire kingdom. So I ask you, what do you think makes a ruler truly great? The ability to command, obedience, or the courage to inspire trust? If this story stirred you, subscribe to the channel for more forgotten tales of kings, queens, and empires. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was Ferdinand VII the worst monarch in history, or simply a man trapped by his time? History is never silent. It whispers through stories like this, waiting for us to listen.